Welcome everyone to the three translators of Kansai SWET Talk Shop, September 6th, or if you're in the States, September 5th, 2020. I would like to very quickly hand things over to the moderator, Larry Walker. But before I do, I would just like to introduce to you what the agenda is. We have the welcome, which this is, and announcements, which Lynn will give us in a moment, Lynn Riggs, and then the interviews, Larry will do them in this order: Eleanor Yamaguchi, Nakamichi, Stuart Ayre. 10 to 15 minute break time, question, answers, and a wrap up. How does that sound? Can I turn it over to you, Larry?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. We originally planned to have a symposium in May, and unfortunately that, along with many things, was canceled this year. And through a suggestion from Lynn, we've revived it in the talk shop format. So I'm very happy to be able to speak with Eleanor, Stuart, and Catherine in this format. And our first interviewee is Eleanor Yamaguchi, who is Associate Professor in International Exchange at Kyoto Prefectural University, where she specializes in Japanese history and culture and UK-Japan relations. Eleanor had stints in Aomori and Aichi before settling in Kyoto in 2019, which I'm particularly happy about because we've become colleagues since then. Eleanor, good morning, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Larry. As I said, yeah, I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm excited about it too. So, yoroshiku onegaishimasu.
Okay, great. Eleanor, you had a real early interest in Japan well before you came. Would you please tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, where to start? I don't want to start too early as the story is quite a long one, but my very, very first interest in Japan was probably helped along by my mom, who worked at a Chinese restaurant when I was a little girl. So we got invited to a Chinese New Year celebration, and that was my first sort of entrance into Asian culture. And I took myself off to the library to find out more about China. Next to the books on China were the books on Japan, and I was really interested in the arts as well around that time. So the kimono design and paintings and this kind of thing, they really caught my imagination, and I had a great influence from my uncle as well. He was often traveling all around the world. He'd go off places like Peru and the Sahara desert. And he told me about him finding a 10-pound note in the Sahara, not belonging to him, but he just happened to find this 10-pound note. So I'd hear all these weird and wonderful stories and thought, right, where am I going to go? And Japan kind of seemed like the furthest place, not only distance-wise, but also culturally as well. I wanted to explore something that was completely different culturally. So yeah, I started off teaching myself Japanese and learning about Japanese culture and things like that. And later on, I went on to Sheffield University in the UK to do Japanese studies. I did my BA there, graduated in 1999. So yeah, quite a long time ago now, but it's been quite a long journey from there, going on from Sheffield. Then after graduating, I went to Aomori as basically to go on the JET program. I was there for about 3 years, and after that I was wondering what to do. I just knew I wanted to stay in Japan, and what could I do? I didn't want to simply go into English language teaching, which a lot of my friends were doing at the time. So I thought I'll take myself back to school. So went and managed to get a place at Kyoto University, and did my master's degree there, and then did the PhD as well. So I didn't plan on spending as many years being a student again as I did. It was about 10 years or so in the end, but managed to get the degree finally. And then after that, I got my post in Aichi Prefectural University. So I was teaching there for 6 or 7 years. And then after that, coming here to Kyoto. And thank you very much for for taking me on at Kyoto Prefectural University. University as well. So it's quite the dream really for me, with my research being related to the 5th prefectural governor. So they have lots of the documents in the Rekisaikan building there. So I'm looking forward to diving into those when we get the chance. But yeah, a long story. That's a shorter version of it. I hope it made sense along the way. So.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, well, and it's I who should be thanking you, because we're quite happy that you're there. Richard, if you could bring up that first slide where we have this very interesting image of your mother being quite. This is actually your
I know
house.
that's me.
You,
this is me.
Yeah, this is you, and something that you've painted on the side of your home.
Yeah, my mum was quite an easygoing person, but she's gotten a bit more strict as she's gotten older. But yeah, she let me paint on the wall of the house outside in the backyard. I was trying to copy one of the ukiyo-e images of this kabuki actor. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to finish it before we had to move house. So I don't know what the people who moved in after us what they thought of it. They probably painted over it. But yeah, this was something. This was on the outside of the house, but I also completely revamped my bedroom. I sort of made these homemade paper walls and homemade tatami mats and things like this. I wish I'd taken photographs of the inside of the house as well. But yeah, this was the days before smartphones where it was very easy to take a photograph. So I don't have one, unfortunately, but it was great fun to do, as I enjoyed painting and scribbling a lot in those days. So I don't get much time for it now, unfortunately. But
oh, it looks fantastic. And then soon after that, when you came to Japan, you developed an interest in Kyoto, and we have a photo of you I believe, which is associated with Roma, which is one of your main interests in life now as well.
Yes, he's up on my wall at the back there as well with the others. Yeah, this was actually the first time that I came to Japan in 96. I was able to visit Kyoto and went to Teradaya in Fushimi, which was one of the places that Sakamoto Ryoma, his hanging scroll is on the picture there. He stayed at this place, and his missus, his wife, Oryo-san, she was working here as well. And the famous story of him getting attacked, but him managing to escape thanks to Oryo-san jumping out of the bath with nothing on, running up the stairs to warn him that somebody was coming to get him. So yeah, this place, it wasn't until quite a few years later. If anybody's been to this place, you might have seen it yourself, but they've got one of these wooden columns on the side that has bullets, like the holes from where bullets are left over. But apparently that building is actually a revamp of the old one, because it was burnt down some years ago. So this is the new version of it. So I don't know what those bullet holes are all about. Maybe they recreated them as well. I don't know, but yeah. But still, it's a nice place to visit for all Ryoma fans, I think.
Fantastic. And you also is the object of one of your main studies. He was the 5th prefectural governor of Kyoto. And how did you hit on Kai and develop your interest in that research?
Yeah, when I was in Sheffield, I mean, I was always interested in the samurai because they're just cool dudes. But, you know, I got interested in Sakamoto Ryoma at first. And I did my graduation thesis about Ryoma in Sheffield. That was my undergraduate degree. And the thesis itself was about why Sakamoto Ryoma was so popular in Japan in modern times. So I was looking into that. And I tried to get into Kyoto University, first of all, more in the history department. And I wrote a letter, I won't say any names, but I wrote to one of the professors there, and he wrote back and he said, well, this is more of a social studies paper that you've done here. And because you're British, you probably won't be able to read any of these old Japanese letters and things like that. So that only made me more determined to get into this. So I wrote to another professor who's an international politics specialist in another department. And fortunately for me, he was actually retiring. So he said he couldn't take me on board, but he had another fellow professor who had recently judged the letter writing competition. They have this letter writing competition where you pretend to be Sakamoto Ryoma and you write to the people of Japan. I don't know if it's something they still do now, but this is one of these events that they had yearly. And because my professor had been the judge of these letters, I was sort of sent in his direction and said, well, okay, you can go and study under him. So I was really fortunate in that, just because he'd been a judge, so he knew a little bit about Ryoma. So that was how I got on the program in Kyoto. And then, of course, from that new professor said to me, well, you can't really continue with doing Ryoma because he's been done to death, so to speak. There's so much written about him, and a lot of people already know very much about him, so it'll be difficult to write anything about him without really struggling. So he said you should try and find somebody else who's not as popular, not as well known. And that's how I came across Nakai in another class. And it just happened that Nakai was a friend of Ryoma's. Yokoyama sensei in Kyoto University asked me to translate Nakai Hiromu's first journal, his travel journal, to the UK. And of course, I wasn't very familiar with this old style of Japanese, but I'd been told before, you'd never be able to do it. And I was determined that I was going to. So that's what set me on this mission of, I'm going to do this damn thing, however long it takes me. So that's how I found Nakai. And it's good because Nakai is not a very well-known character at all. So it means I can be the specialist on him. And nobody can argue with me. Well, they can try, I suppose.
Yeah, excellent. And you turned those into several interesting papers and eventually your dissertation on that. And maybe, Richard, if we could bring up the next slide of the two books, which I believe this is a series that was initiated by Hugh Cortazzi, the former English Aichi ambassador to Japan and a scholar himself. That must have been a fascinating bit of work to do as well.
Yeah, the green one. I was really surprised. The professor in Kyoto University who told me about Nakai, he said that he'd been asked by Hugh to write a chapter about Nakai in this biographical portrait series, but he'd never had the opportunity, he'd never really had the time to do it, rather. And he kind of said to me, oh, you should do that for this, this series. I thought, wow, Hugh Cortazzi, wow, yeah, that would be really good. Yeah, I'll do it. But I didn't really put myself out there at all. And then a few years down the line, I suddenly got this email from Sir Hugh myself. And I was like, oh my God, there's an email from this amazing, guy. So yeah, he asked me to write the chapter for them, which I did, and it was a fantastic opportunity. The other book, I did a chapter on a guy called Muto Chozo, who I did while I was in Aichi. And Muto Chozo, he was a scholar in Nagasaki. He was at Nagasaki University, and he was studying all about the connection between Britain and Japan. And he'd done a very small book about UK-Japan relations. And it was at the time while I was teaching at Aichi, I was trying to find something that would be useful to show students. But it turned out this book was no longer in print. So that's something I'm trying to do at the moment, is put together a very basic text of UK-Japan relations, just for the sake of my students as well. But yeah, that opportunity with the biographical portraits was really fantastic for me. I'd never thought that I'd get an email from somebody like Sir Hugh and have that opportunity to write for that work, because I'd been a fan from a distance from a long time, looking at this thing thinking, oh, one of these days I want to do this, but never really, as I say, putting myself out there. So that was quite nice. Yeah.
Fantastic. And we have a slide of also what your workflow looks like. And we have to remember that Nakai was really writing himself at a time before, I guess we call it Genbunichi, or the language became what we would look at and see in the newspaper and so on today. Please tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here.
Yeah, this is my very untidy scribbles of when I was doing the translation of the first travel journal. Because basically the print that I had was really, really tiny. The characters were really, really tiny. So I decided to rewrite the whole thing in my own handwriting, one so that I could see it, but also to get a feel for the words themselves, if that makes sense. So I wrote the whole thing out, and then underneath that I scribbled my my translation sort of thing under it. And I'm doing the same thing now for his second travel journal, and it is a very, very long process, but for me it's really the best way for me to be able to understand. So I was having difficulties with, particularly because he doesn't really give a lot of detail about place names or even people's names and things like that. He meets this guy in katakana. He decides to call him Martin, Marton, and there are different variations on this person's name. So is it Mr. Martin, Mr. Merton? Is it something else? And I had difficulty with that, with his use of katakana, and things like, I figured out eventually that I think it was Madame Tussauds that Nakai visited, but he doesn't say anything about ro ningyo. He doesn't say, these wax dolls or anything like that. He just says statues, and then describes the people that he's seen in these statues. So there's Garibaldi, there's Napoleon, there's all these famous names. And then he talks about seeing Commissioner Lin, who was the Chinese chap who was fighting off the British in the Opium Wars. And Nakai says, this museum in Britain, it even has a statue of a British enemy. So, wow, that's something of note. And it was only because of that Commissioner Lin and a couple of other characters that I thought maybe it's the Waxwork Museum, because if it was, I don't know, marble statues or something like that, I don't know if they'd have such modern characters, well, for what was for then modern characters. So those kind of things are really, really difficult to try and figure out what he was talking about in each case. He writes Sini John in katakana, and I was trying to figure out for a long time. It was the name of a hospital. He said he goes to this hospital and it's called Sini John in katakana. So I'm trying to find this Sini John in London that was a hospital. I came across St. John's Hospice. I thought maybe it was this, checked from when this hospital was there, and okay, the dates fit and this kind of thing. So maybe it's this place. But yeah, a lot of it was real sort of guesswork in a lot of cases, and I felt more like a private investigator or something than a translator, because so much of it was very, very obscure stuff. But yeah, it was good fun, but those kind of things really make it take a long time to do.
It really sounds fascinating. And you have to be a bit of a literary sleuth as well, because he writes Chinese poetry, which you've also translated. And I'd like to talk about that more. Perhaps we can get to that in the question part, because our time has just about come up. Would you please write any questions that come to mind in the chat line, and then we'll get to those in the question period. Fantastic. Thank you again, Eleanor. Let us move on now to Stuart Ayre. Stuart is a Japanese to English legal translator based in Tokyo, but he's actually foremost in art. Originally a technical translator at Toyota, Stuart switched to legal translation in 2013 and worked right downtown in Tokyo for several years until he decided to go freelance, translating mainly court documents and contracts, and relocated in Kyoto. And Stuart is also known for his artwork and illustrations, which we'd like to touch on later as well. Stuart, thank you for being here. And let me start out by asking, what brought you to Japan initially?
Let me see. I was working in London, graduated from uni, moved to London, and I was a tour guide for about a year. I was one of those people, with a microphone on a double-decker bus going around London many times a day. And I met people from all around the world on those buses. And I remember the Japanese were just very delightful. I remember once I'd forgotten my jacket and we were going down the embankment in London, and it was freezing, and this Japanese, I guess he was a salaryman, sort of guy in his 50s, he gave me his jacket. You could see I was shivering a bit. And at the end of the tour, I gave it back to him. He said, no, you can keep it. You can have it. So I thought, wow, that's very nice. And I had a few different encounters like that in London. Aside from that personal connection, I was interested in calligraphy. I was interested in Japanese calligraphy, which I touched on in my studies at university. Yeah, so there wasn't like one main reason for traveling to Japan. Lots of small reasons, I'd say.
Okay, and how did you end up? I mean, translation for an automobile company and legal translation are not things that you just get with a casual acquaintanceship with the Japanese language. How did you develop your studies?
Before I came to Japan, I hadn't studied Japanese. And so I was eager to do that formally, in a classroom with textbooks, do it that way. And so I enrolled in a school full-time in Aichi. And after leaving that school, I was basically there until my funds ran out. I worked in an izakaya, taught English, did a couple of homestays, really good, let me see, year and a half, I'd say. My funds ran out, and so I looked for a job, and I found one at Toyota in Aichi, which was just down the road from the school I was at.
Okay, and so you were able to work and learn on the job, as it were?
Yeah, it was good old OJT. I had more senior translator / interpreter in the same office as me, and it was literally go in this meeting and interpret, translate these documents. So yeah, I remember the first couple of years being rather stressful, especially the interpreting, especially being going in at 9:30. You get your cup of coffee, sit down, you think you're going to have a nice day, translating some manual, and then a sort of worried looking boss runs over to you and says, go in that meeting room right now. But I think like in a lot of jobs, you develop a tolerance for that stress. You develop an ability to think clearly, even when, the pressure's turned up, when you're feeling the pressure. And so it was a good way to learn that. Because I think we're often, obviously interpreting is immensely difficult, but I think if you can keep your calm, many of us, you can do quite a lot as long as you keep your calm. So yeah, it was kind of a sink or swim. I think you just had to, do it or leave the job, basically.
You had to jump in the deep end, it looks like,
yeah. Yeah.
And then you decided to switch to legal translation. And is that what brought you to Tokyo? That's
right. I had been interested in law since university. I lived with a bunch of students studying law and got on with them very well. And whilst at Toyota, the global recalls were going on. And in the midst of all that, there were quite a lot of legal documents to translate. Toyota in Japan was feeding information to its distributors around the world, mainly the one in America. And they needed to inform them of a lot of information that was in Japanese very quickly. It was the news, the media were jumping all over them, and they really needed to figure out what the situation was and give the right information to the media. There were congressional hearings coming up as well that had to be prepared for. So in that whole mix, there were a few legal documents, and they were thrown to me. I wasn't really capable of doing them, but I was the best they had at that time in that particular office. And I remember thinking I'd really like to learn how to do this, how to take these big chunks of text with all these words I don't really know. How can I put that into legible English? So my interest peaked there. And then after leaving Toyota, I was freelance for a couple of years and worked most of that time on lawsuits related to fuku. There were obviously lots of lawsuit lawsuits going on at that time. And so I spent a lot of time in those 2 years working with, a couple of law firms, translating, legal litigation documents, court documents, and contracts that had been signed years back, that kind of thing. And I thought, I want more of this. I like this, but I can't really do it. I could tell, when I'd click the send button, to the client, I had my fingers crossed. You kind of know when you're not sure of things. And so that's when I decided to go in-house, go and work at an actual law firm and learn how to do it properly.
Interesting. So legal translation must have given you insight into various aspects of life that I guess the average person really doesn't come into contact with on a daily basis. What has legal translation taught you?
I think we all have some contact with the legal world, be it lawyers or legal documents. We all click agree to those terms and conditions online, that kind of thing. And I think the older we get, the more kind of legal things crop up in your life. I think, working within the law, and I think this is why many people enjoy it, is indeed because you just learn so many things about so many different things. One of the main things is what I touched on a moment ago, the sort of tolerance for stress. You're in a very stressful environment. Deadlines are tight. You can tell the people around you are stressed, and you've got to deal with it. You can't go run into mummy. You've got this task to do, and you've got to do it. No excuses. It's like I remember thinking it felt like the Rosetta Stone had just landed on my desk, and you have to do it. You have to translate it there and then. And so that was one of the main things I learned. I think a lot of us, we as long as you keep you calm, you can do an awful lot. Let's see. One of the main things I was told when I first started working at that law firm was the main thing you'll probably learn here. It's not really, you won't probably learn about the law. You're not going to learn about, the civil code, the constitution, that kind of thing. You'll probably learn how to write really good English. That's what, if you can stick it out for a few years, your English will get better. You'll learn, how to get pedantic about things and learn how, usage of various punctuation and how to, arrange a sentence so it can only be interpreted in a single way. Yeah, that was say those are the main two things. There's a whole list of things. I don't want to kind of go on about this too much, but I'd say those are the two main things, Larry.
Okay, interesting. And you prepared a slide for us so that we can have some idea of what you're looking at. And
oh yeah,
I believe, Richard, if you could bring up that first screenshot for us. Then this is an application that you use for breaking down longer sentences. What are we seeing here?
Well, this is an app I use on my iPad. It's called Notability. It's so many good apps out there for note-taking. This is my favorite one. And what I do is, generally, I don't do this for the entire document, but say if I've got like a real kind of horror show of a sentence where it's just going on and on and on and it's difficult to pass, I find that if I throw it in this app and use the different colors and the highlights and the marks on it, I can make sense of it. And then once I've made sense of how everything relates to each other, and which often takes a bit of time, it's difficult to know which bits relate to which. Once I've done that, I'll start translating it. And so I often put these sort of red go in with those obliques. I've got my little system for that. And then, say if there's ABC or, Roman numerals or something, highlight those. This is, I should say to everyone, this is a particularly horrible example of a sentence in a document. This is fairly rare. This particular document was went in forever, and it was sentences like this. So it was quite the challenge. But yeah, that's how I use that, Larry.
I see. Interesting. And so that's a pre-translation. thing, so that you just get oriented and you know what you're looking at, and then you start translating from there.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, initially, often with a complex legal document, it's often complex as in long and lots of defined terms. It's often part of, a suite of documents. So if you've got the time, if the deadline isn't in a couple of hours, it's often good to do a bit of this pre-translation work. I know some legal translators, they'll go through the document and try and find the nasty bits, the bits that are gonna take a lot of work to for you to spin it into some kind of decent translation. And as part of that work, say if I find then again, at that stage, I wouldn't do what I'm doing here with the notation. I'd do that when I actually get to it. So I'd translate up to that portion and then do that notation.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll have some interesting questions about that. It sounds like you're really in the pressure cooker a lot there. How about we switch to your more right brain oriented interest, which is your art and illustrations. I've asked Stuart to share with us today some of his work, and since Stuart is based in Kyoto now, and here I think that was Gion in the evening in the rain. And the rain seems to be a theme that you like to work on.
I don't know if it's reflecting my mood at that time, but I just find Japanese cities, because of the lights, the adverts and the taxis with the little lights on top, just look amazing at night time. So I like to paint them, try and capture that.
It's beautiful. And of course, we can see the MK symbol for those of us
yes,
in Kansai. Okay, Richard, how about navigating to the next one? And here is a classic scene of the river around, how far north is this?
This is Demachi Anagi, so I guess it's a bit south of where you work.
Right, so just really when the two forks come together, yes.
Yeah.
That's beautiful, I like that. And I noticed in the naming, this was number 51, so you do sketches, you do many sketches of the same.
Yeah, I like to sort of counterbalance the legal translation, where it's all about keeping to the rules, and you can't really get that creative when you're translating legal documents. And so it's a good way for me just to relax. And I started doing that when I was working in Tokyo. I found that on Sundays I'd be quite stressed, but I'd have some kind of deadline, and I found that if I did a 5-minute sketch or 10-minute sketch, in lunch, or just went to the cafeteria, I could reset, and then I'd be fresh to go back and jump into the translation. So it was born from that. And then now I usually, because Kyoto's just like a big oil painting, it all looks amazing. And so I'll translate in the day, and then when I've got a break or when I've done work, I'll go out and paint. Yeah, I like can't really describe it, but I just find I need to do both of them, and they kind of help each other. Actually, I find that I can, I think legal translation has helped my art, and art has helped my legal translation.
Interesting. Let's have a quick look, Richard, at the last couple. Next one. This next one here is close to my heart. Here we are at Todaiji, and I think this is a particularly fascinating view. So you're actually sitting there and doing, so you spent a good deal of time in Todaiji.
Yeah, I have spent way too much time in that temple. It's very, the gift that keeps on giving. There's so much to see in there. This isn't a finished picture. It's a preparation for another one I'm doing, but I usually go there. I was there yesterday, actually, good 4 hours, maybe up to 6 or 7, just try and, I find it's one of those subjects, it's really good practice if you're into sketching, or illustrating, because it's so unforgiving. You if you get, you know, the perspective wrong or the Buddha's face wrong, something like that, it's immediately obvious. And so it's good. It's a good workout, good kind of like boot camp in there. And yeah, so if I'm not legal translating, I'll go and see the Buddha, basically.
Do you feel, as I do, that there's a particular energy, something that just seems to be happening inside that building?
It's difficult to answer that. I find that I get that more with the Kamakura Daibutsu. For some reason, there's something, I don't know how to put it into words, but I feel more of a connection with that one, I think. I find that with Todaiji, it's definitely bewitching, especially if you dive into its history. And, you know, and the way it was constructed, and the sort of sorry history it's had, the way in which its head's been replaced, its hands have been replaced, it's been, you know, wars have been going on around it. It's definitely, it's one of those places you can just sit for hours and enjoy, you know, and enjoy all the sort of reactions people have to it as well. You know, you get these sort of waves of people coming in, not so much now, but usually, and they all, you know, from little tots to more elderly people, everyone sort of has quite a big reaction to it.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. It's in a sense, it's very an inner experience and also a shared experience. Anyway, yeah. It's beautiful, and I can't wait to see the finished product. Just one more quick slide here that I think all SWET members could probably find here is Hiroshige's wave and tsunami of paperwork. This is a very fantastic concept here. What inspired this?
I mean, that was basic. That was how I felt. It was one of those days when you've got, you know, deadlines that are hard to meet. You know, and often with legal translators, I don't know if there are any in the audience, but, you know, you look at a document and it's like, well, I can do this in 2 hours. I can do this in 2.5 hours. You've got to be quite accurate with your predictions. And I find on some days when you'll read the clock's just ticking louder and louder, and you can feel yourself losing grip, you know, on all these things you're doing. And I need to reset. I need to just draw something. So that's when I drew. That's when I drew this. So I drew this at that moment, and then colored it later. So it's that. Yeah, that's basically me having a crisis right there.
Well, that's fantastic. It does really show the juxtaposition between the intensity of the legal translation you're doing and your artwork.
Oh, great.
Yeah, very interesting, Stuart. Thank you very much. Really
Thank you, Larry.
All right, then, can we get a spotlight on Catherine as we keep moving along here, trying to keep up with the clock? Hi, Catherine.
Hello.
All right, Catherine is also a specialist in Japanese to English translation, and she works in the fields of technology, health, medical issues, education, academia, retail, and marketing, as well as arts, handicrafts, sports, cultural festivals, hospitality, and tourism. And this is all through your company, Catlingual, which you founded in 2006. That's amazing. And you also keep active, of course, with SWET and JAT and the Foreign Executive Women of Kansai. It sounds incredibly busy. How are you doing all these things, in addition to being a mother and wife?
Daughter-in-law at the moment and caregiver. Yeah, a lot of it has given way to caring for my in-laws at the moment. And I'm focusing only on work that has long deadlines, like the books. So yeah, other than that, I'm not working a great deal at the moment on my translation.
Okay, well, I'd like to hit on just a couple of the things that you've been active with before everything got shut down. You've worked with the Melbourne-Osaka yacht race, which sounds really fascinating. Is that something that happens in Osaka and then Melbourne?
The Melbourne to Osaka yacht race is a race that was happening every 4 years and then switched to 5. And the next one is supposed to coincide with the expo. Melbourne and Osaka are sister cities. The race is a double-handed yacht race, so only 2 people on a yacht crossing the ocean, starting in Melbourne and arriving in Osaka with no stops on the way.
Oh my goodness.
Right. I've been involved since, 1993. It's the only time I will accept any sort of interpreting work. I figure I'm one of the few people on this earth who can interpret between drunk Aussie sailors and drunk Japanese sailors. It's quite a challenge a lot of the time, but the other nice thing is that I don't have to be perfect. Because they don't realize. But yeah, it's a lot of fun, and it's also very challenging. When the weather's bad, we need to be checking up on all the boats, and low pressure systems develop in the islands, particularly sort of around Papua New Guinea and places like that, and just beyond Papua New Guinea. Then we need to make sure that we're having check-ins with all the yachts, and that can be very, very pressured, and it needs to be very fast, very quick, and bilingual all the way through.
Okay, and that, I'm sure that keeps you day and night then.
Yes, yeah, it's no sleep. At the end, it's no sleep for 2 weeks, basically.
Okay, well, we look forward to that coming back.
Yes, hopefully, if the expo goes on.
Yeah, and I can see you're wearing a lovely yukata. We can't see too much, but that's, you have quite an interest in Japanese fabrics, kimono, yukata, and
I do. I guess this is my creative outlet. I made, this was the second one I made, I think. I've also made doe kimono and an awase kimono for winter, which has Australian designs on it. I wanted to wear it today, but it's too hot. And I also do Japanese embroidery, which anyone on my Facebook will know.
embroidery. Oh my, is that done by hand?
Yes.
Oh, wow, fantastic. Okay, well, I look forward to learning more about that. But let's now talk about some of the books that you've been working on, which are quite fascinating. Richard, I wonder, would you please bring up that first slide that has a copy of a couple of the books that Catherine has already published through Maruzen. As we can see, the titles are about traditional Japanese culture and Japanese arts and handicrafts. Catherine, what are some of the specific challenges you face when writing such books?
Oh, the first challenge was the brief I got from the publisher. They wanted a lot and then some icing on the top of it. The English had to be appropriate for sort of junior high school graduation level, and it also needed to be useful to foreign visitors and easy enough for people who don't speak English to provide information to visitors, perhaps to a shop or to a museum or something like that. This was the aim of the publisher. However, for the first one, as you see, I don't know if you can see that, I can't see myself. I only got a third, or approximately, there we go, a quarter or so of the page in which to write my English. And as you know, English takes up a lot more space than Japanese. So somehow I had to pull the most interesting or most important information out of the Japanese and then put it into very simple English without using terms of art as much as possible, and not lose too much. And that thinned out the hair quite a bit. I can tell you what, and grade it considerably. There are places where I don't think I succeeded, to be honest. It's the first one. This one was a little bit, well, I mean, I thought it was very difficult when I was doing it because it's tangible objects for the most part, or things that people can sort of see and touch. On the other hand, this one, which is the traditional customs, is almost all intangible. And trying to explain something to people who perhaps don't have any knowledge already these complicated everyday customs in Japan really was really, really difficult. And I had to make a lot of choices that perhaps I wouldn't have made if it was a different type of book. Louise asked who published it. It's Maruzen.
Yes. Yeah. And so what was the idea? Maruzen was aiming at the domestic audience primarily.
Yes, and then decided that they'd like to increase it to the foreign audience as well. And I do know from people that it's the first one in particular is in Japanese bookshops in New York and in Sydney and in London, which is kind of exciting.
Oh, that's fantastic. What kind of choices did you have to make? I mean, did you have a hierarchy? I mean, Richard, we have a draft, a couple of things that Catherine did. If you could bring those up, and maybe Catherine, you might be able to comment on that. I mean, did you basically just translate everything and then look at the English and decide what you could keep, or?
No, not next one, Richard, I think. That's the next book. This one will be released at the end of this month.
Okay, yes, that's the coming soon book. Yeah.
Yes, it's the coming soon.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, one of the choices I had to make was how to deal with Heian era, Heian Jidai, Edo Jidai, and that sort of thing. Whether to leave that in the English and then add the dates, which would probably be my normal practice, but it ended up taking up a lot of my very, very minimal space. So I then had to decide which way I would write it. Would I keep it as Heian era or Edo era or Muromachi period or whatever, or would I use simply the years, the dates? And I ended up going with just the dates for the most part. There are a couple of places where I felt that the period really needed to be mentioned, but I needed to, so you can see there in Confucius, I did the particular dates for him instead of the Japanese way of giving dates. I also, if I was given something like early Nara period or something like that, I would then try and go and research the actual thing and try and find what century it happened. So I would try and narrow down to 100 years or so in order to allow the books to be relatable to people who don't have a lot of knowledge about Japan, but who would hear a century or dates and be able to match it in their own heads as to when that actually happened. I think people who don't know much about Japan, people maybe have heard of Heian or Edo, but very few more familiar with Muromachi and things like that, or even before Heian period. So that was one choice. Another, again, was terms of art. As I was trying to make it simple but concise, I really wanted to use a lot more of the English terms of art, but ended up choosing a more common word. And in many cases, I used the Japanese term in nomaji with an explanation, a short word in English, so that people could actually go and research a bit more if they were interested in that. The challenge, yeah, that really was difficult, and much more so for the customs book, because many of the customs, of course, are based in things that don't really exist in an English-speaking society. A lot of the things in the book that came up, I'm like, oh yeah, we do that every month. I had no idea that that's what I was doing. Well, that's the reason why I was doing it. I live in a very traditional household. My father-in-law is a farmer. He's been in this area for, I don't know how many years or how many hundreds of years. So a lot of the things in the customs book are things that we sort of do around the house or around, throughout the year that I hadn't really realized were as important as they are.
Yes, that must be quite the difficult balance to strike as you're immersed completely in it yourself, and then, learning about it when you see the Japanese text, and then trying to, I guess, in a sense, dilute it down to something that the English speaker could work with as well.
Right. And I think I ended up making a choice, I hope, that meant that people could use the book as a springboard to further research if they were. And I hope it works that way, because I had to leave so much information out of the English because of the space restrictions.
That must gnaw at you quite a bit.
Oh yeah.
Oh, Richard, could we bring up the second slide, which is the book that's about to come out?
Came out of the first one, Traditional Arts and Handicrafts, because we realized as we were doing it that the people behind things were so very important. And there's some really interesting people who have had a huge effect on Japanese culture as we know it today. And we really wanted to know, a lot of the times you will also go to a temple or something and they'll say, oh, so-and-so is enshrined here. And you're like, okay, so what did they do? I don't know who they are. And hopefully this book will answer a few of those questions. We tried also to leave out really obvious people that everybody knows. Or if we did have very famous people, we tried to show a side of them that not many people are aware of. A lot of the famous warriors and leaders of Japan were also great sophisticates and highly skilled tea masters and connoisseurs of art and ceramics and all sorts of quite fascinating aspects to these people.
Well, it really looks interesting, and I'm looking forward to getting a copy of that one as well. Wendy Uchimura has been asking in the chat, because Kansai has a different culture to Kanto and other areas of Japan, how do you think this has benefited you or contributed to your choice in translation paths? This is for all three speakers. Is there something any of the speakers would like to address here about living in Kansai?
I don't mind going ahead first, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah, my work absolutely has to be Kyoto, because all of the guys that I'm translating, all of the work they've done, it's all been sort of based in Kyoto, the historical stage, so to speak. So as I mentioned, I was living in Aichi for a few years. I was teaching there, and while I was there, I found it really, really difficult to keep a focus on the work that I was doing, on the research that I was doing. So one of the reasons that I wanted to come back to Kyoto was the fact that I wasn't able to access the sources that I'm looking at. So it's only a couple of hours or so on the Shinkansen, but it made quite a difference because I've also got a lot of the connections and so on that I have as a member of the Kyoto Ryomakai, for example. They get together for different things and have different events, and having those personal connections is quite important for the work that I'm doing as well. So Kyoto is an absolute in my case.
Well, thank you, Eleanor. Stuart?
It hasn't made a substantial difference. I don't think I still do the same work, still work for the same, law firms and agencies. It's definitely takes a bit more work to actually see, customers in person, especially so with the coronavirus. I think the main thing about living in Kyoto is that it's just very relaxing here. You know, you feel like, you know, you can jump on your bicycle and quickly be in a good mood, you know. It's good for your stress levels, I think.
Yeah, that's definitely. Okay, thanks, Stuart. Catherine, have you always lived in the Moriguchi area?
Since I got married, yes. Don't really have an option to go anywhere else. As I told you, my husband's household is very traditional, and they've been here for years and have land as farmers, so it's not really an option to go anywhere else. It's a really interesting question. I know Kathy, who's carefully working, so I shouldn't distract her, but she moved from Kansai to Tokyo and she's done really well. Now, I don't know whether that was just because of the move. I suspect it's just because she's really good at what she does. But I sort of feel that most of my work has come from personal connections in Kansai. And a lot of the work that I was doing for SWET and JET and running events and helping with events and things like that has been a large part of making those personal connections. But I have clients in sort of other parts of Japan as well. So I don't know that it makes a great deal of a difference.
Yeah, I suppose anywhere in Japan, the personal connections are really key, perhaps maybe in the generally considered to be a little bit friendlier area of Osaka, especially, that might something that's extra important, and it kind of takes a toll now that we're not really seeing anybody anywhere. Okay, Eleanor, Kyla is asking about your master's and doctoral courses. Were the courses taught in Japanese, and you know, how were you able to keep up, and how did you prepare yourself for that?
The courses were in Japanese. I had to sit through the entrance exam as all the other Japanese students did. The only difference was that for some reason I was allowed to take the English exam, which seems a bit silly, but hey, I passed. So that was okay. And I think for one of the questions on the history side of things was about William Morris. And because I'd studied fashion design in the UK and I was interested in those arts, I was able to write something about William Morris. So for some reason, I was just really, really lucky with the questions, I suppose, on the entrance exam. But my professor, I think somebody also asked about my professor. My supervisor was actually a chap called Nakamichi Terumasa, but I also worked very closely with Yokoyama Toshio sensei. He was the one who introduced me to Nakai's work. So I was working with both professors, and they both knew each other really well as well, because they'd both been in Britain, studying in Britain at the same time, so they were very close. I think Yokoyama sensei was in Cambridge while my sensei was in Oxford, so they were the Oxbridge boys for a time. But yeah, the classes were all in Japanese. I think for most of the classes, I was the only non-Japanese person there, so it was really hard keeping up. And I was quite fortunate in that when it came to my turn to do presentations, I could ask my fellow classmates to sort of help me out a little bit, check my handouts before I went and did the presentations. But yeah, for many ways, I think it was that experience really helped me with my Japanese ability as well. I mean, I'd studied at Sheffield and I'd been teaching myself for years before, but you know, this was a little bit like Stuart was saying earlier, really being thrown into the deep end, I think really helped me with the language skills as well. So I learned a lot about, I probably missed quite a lot as well in many ways. A lot of it I think went over my head, but still I picked up a great deal along the way as well. So yeah, it was basically, I was a foreign student, but also a Japanese student being allowed into that. That was an interesting experience as well.
Yeah, a lot of hard work, I'm sure. We have another, thank you, Eleanor. We have another question from Kyla to Stuart. She asks that a lot of your learning about legal translation was on the job. And what are some of the resources that help you get up to pace with everything?
Let me see. I think resources can be split mainly into two types. One's in Japanese and one's in English. I think with legal translation, at least in my experience at working at law firm, there's often disagreement between native English speakers and native Japanese speakers on how things should be translated. And so if you can look into the resources, for each of those, for basically how to write legal English, Brian Garner, basically anything he's published, his dictionaries or his guides on drafting, thorough and practical and good. Ken Adams, his resources, his blog is similarly good. For the Japanese side, how to go from Japanese to English, but written in Japanese, described by a Japanese person. Emiko Izumi, there's a book, at least one book, co-authored by her, which is good. I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but that was, on the desks of people when I was working in-house, and that was useful to consult.
What was the first author that you mentioned, Stuart?
Oh, sorry, Larry. It's Brian Garner. He's the editor of Black's, the Big Law Dictionary. He's sort of the granddaddy of legal English.
Yeah, especially in such a specialization, it's important to get in touch with the, your native language aspect of it, not taking for granted that you know everything.
Absolutely,
okay,
absolutely.
Dictionary, I haven't heard that yet. Okay, and then looking for the question. Kat, thanks, Stuart. And here's a question from Angela. Kat, about the Maruzen series of books, were you aware that from the start that you'd have to work within such a restricted word count for the English version?
I was originally given 10 lines out of the total 34 to a page. I pushed back. That was including the title that comes above. I pushed back and I said, that's not going to give you anything in English, because English takes up so much more space than the Japanese. And I think I got an extra 2 lines plus the sort of subheading line, which made some difference. But yeah, it would have been nice to just be able to translate all of the Japanese, because a lot of it's quite fascinating. But I think also somebody asked about choices and summaries and pushback from the publisher. Actually, our head editor, he's a lovely man. We had a couple of in-person meetings before we even started writing. And after those meetings, basically, as long as the other authors accepted what I said went. Between the authors, we had some discussion, but again, most of it went my way because I could back up my reason. I had specific reasons for it that they really couldn't sort of argue with.
Okay, so you had some initial pushback and some extra pushback, and but you didn't quite get as much as you wanted. I got the feeling.
Space-wise, there really isn't a lot of space anyway. And the purpose of the book, as far as the publisher's intent for sales, was pretty specific. My pushback was really based on the fact that with that little space, there were going to be places where I wasn't going to achieve their purpose. So that's where I got the extra. And the other 2 authors were quite happy to write a bit less.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, it's so important to have that dialogue between all of the parties involved. Fantastic. Thank you, Catherine. Question in from Yoko Takara. First to Stuart. How do you cope when you come across sentences in the law material that are incomprehensible?
Yeah, that happens. It particularly happens, say, if you jump in between one kind of project onto another one, you're just suddenly thrown in. It feels like that program Quantum Leap years back, where you're just suddenly in this new world and you're like, God, what's going on? But I've got to do it. In those situations, you've just got to sit down and figure out what you don't know. There'll be a word you don't understand, or you just need to sit down and look at, identify what you're not understanding. It might be a particular verb. It might be, if it's a really long sentence, try and split it into 2. Sometimes there will be a problem in the actual Japanese, if the person drafting it has just gone too quickly, and something that often happens is they get the party names the wrong way round. So you're like, well, that person owes party A owes party B. Why is it the other way around? What's going on? Sometimes it's an issue with the Japanese. So in answer to your question, just sit down, and if you've got a calm head, you can often figure it out. So just to take a bit of time to, figure out the different elements and what it's trying to say.
Okay, I see what you mean. And there are times when the actual Genbun itself has some issues, in which case you liaise with the client and point out the
yes.
I guess.
Yeah, I think that's part of the service you can supply to lawyers. You can say, hey, this is a bit fishy. You might want to check this. So if you leave I usually leave a few notes. Oftentimes, that deadline is looming, so you've just got to deal with it as you see fit and describe what you've done. But it's a good question, because that does happen. You definitely feel like the Rosetta Stone's been dropped on your desk, and oh my God, and I've got to do this in a couple of hours. That does happen. But you find that if you just take a deep breath, do a little drawing or whatever you want to do, and you can get through it.
Okay, yeah, I think that really does sound like a challenge, especially under time constraints.
Yeah,
Catherine. Catherine, you mentioned that you come across especially aspects of intangible Japanese culture that really don't have any reliable equivalent in English. You said in some cases you left the romaji and then gave a short explanatory phrase. Are there any other strategies you have for those situations?
I guess I did attempt, particularly with the customs book, to place it within a context that would have some meaning for the reader who maybe doesn't know a lot about Buddhism or Shintoism and the differences and that sort of thing. I don't, to be honest, know how successful I've really been. I probably need somebody else to read it and tell me. It was a constant issue and constantly in the back of my head how to put that. As many of the things and the customs, like I said, are part of my daily life, but I hadn't realized that I was actually performing them. They are so ingrained in what's going on from day to day. So for me, they had a lot of context. It was very difficult for me to then take it out of my context and realize that other people were not going to have that sort of context. Like I said, I don't know how successful I really was. I tried my best.
It's a delicate balance, to be sure. And as you say, you don't really know what the general reader is, how much insight they have into it or not. That's
exactly. I don't want to treat them like complete idiots, and I don't want to treat them as though they know lots. So yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Catherine. Susan asks an interesting question. She noticed that all three of you were using, hand marked or actually handwritten text, and because Susan has put this all to working on a keyboard, she wonders, is perhaps there a different mental space that handwriting provides? Eleanor, you're using these, well, let's call it the vintage method of longhand in your work.
Yeah. Well, the whole reason for me to do it is, if it makes sense, to get a feel for what Nakai himself was feeling when he was writing it, if that makes sense. Not just the meanings of the words, but the writing out the kanji in those long formats rather than the modern forms that we have today and things like that. And of course, as I said earlier, just so that I could see it bigger. The text that I had, the characters were really, really tiny and difficult to see. So when I was coming back through my notes and so on, I wanted to be able to see those in larger characters. But I think obviously my final draft was, I typed it up on the computer, but for me, when I'm doing a translation, I feel like I can understand it better if I write it with my own hand, if that makes sense.
Oh, I can definitely see that. Yeah, and he certainly at his time was working a brush, and so okay, that gives you, a feeling for maybe for what he was doing. So you're actually copying everything he wrote that you're translating.
Yeah, it's an old writing style. So, I mean, even the scroll I've got behind me here, that's one of Nakai's, and you might think that I know what it says. I don't yet. It's a new one. It's something about a chaya. He's written it for this tea house the customers were, and they had it for a while. But it's that sort of getting used to his handwriting and things like that. I find that if I can write it down in my own handwriting, I can make more sense of it, kind of, and get, as I said, get used to the actual characters themselves, what those characters are that he's writing in his handwriting. Even when it's in print and it's really, really tiny, it's in the older versions of the kanji characters, and I don't know, I find it hard to remember the modern kanji characters as much as the old ones as well, so it helps me in that way as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, please.
For me, I started the first book by working entirely online and entirely using the keyboard or dictating. But I found that because of my space restrictions, I was deleting and reorganizing and playing around with it so much that I messed up the template several times. But also, it meant that I also lost what I deleted. If I work on paper and I cross things out, I can see them again and add them back in and decide what's more important and what's not. So it really depends. A lot of my technical and medical work, I don't do on paper at all. So it really depends on what I'm trying to do.
I see. So depending on the subject, and that you're more inclined to use the handwriting for the cultural or the less cut and dry material.
Yes, because especially with the books, because more than being translation, it was English writing. I was writing the English for the books based on the Japanese more than really translating it.
Okay. Thanks, Catherine. Stuart, this is a question that student Susan had asked because she saw the handwritten translation and Stuart using the application for markup. And Catherine and spoken about how they use it, and what you're using, although it's an application, it looks pretty obvious that you're making your own notations. So what Susan asked, that she says she's surprised by this, and she finds keyboard so much faster. Is it a different mental space that the handwriting provides?
One piece of advice someone gave me a year or two back was that if you've got a problem, if you can't translate something, try and disrupt things. Go into a different room, print it out, do something like that. And I think that by putting the horrible long sentence into an app, you definitely can, you see it with fresh eyes. So it helps in that respect. I actually, if I've got time, once I've done the translation, I'll print it out and then check it with a red pen against the source documents. But I highly recommend giving it a go, trying an app, note-taking app. Notability is my recommendation. Yeah, because you can see it with fresh eyes.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. And now that we're on the topic of writing something with your hand, one question was asked about the medium for the pieces that we showed earlier. Were those all the same? Was it the ghost, or what particular medium was that?
So they're all different, actually. So I think the first two, gouache and watercolor. So you start off with a sketch in a dry medium, pencil or pencil crayon, and then you go in with the gouache and the watercolor. Gouache is a bit more viscous than watercolor. So if you need more solid colors, you mix in some gouache with the watercolor. The temple one is almost all digital. I do sketches the old-fashioned way initially, just to try and kind of figure out the composition, where the lights and darks are, that kind of thing. And then you go in, you do it digitally to paint on site there would be impossible. I think you'd need to be very in with the high priest there, I think, to let them, so that for them to allow you in with your easel and everything. But pencil, you can do pencil sketches, but beyond that, it's digital paint, iPad basically. And then the last one is a combination. So the sketch is in pencil, and then I added the color digitally. Does that make sense?
I see. So yeah, but it's the gouache itself is something that you're sketching, or you're sketching directly to the iPad.
Oh no, those first two are completely analog, no iPad or anything there, completely sketch, on actual paper, and then you have actual paints, and you 100%, real objects, real thing. Yeah, and I those are the rain one. I do a sketch if it's a rainy one. I'll do a sketch there, but finish it off at home because you can't paint in the rain. But the sunny ones, I do, they're on site. Sit there for an hour or two and paint it in that location.
Okay, interesting. I encourage everyone to have a look at Stuart's website, and you can browse through some of the amazing things he has available there. This is all the questions I can see, but I perhaps overlooked something. So would anybody like to jump in with a question?
Kat, there was a question from Beatrice.
I just answered it. No, I didn't have a style sheet. It was up to me, and basically. And I'm glad that I didn't have one, because it would have made it very difficult, I think, within the space restrictions.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my question was whether Kat had a style sheet to follow. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Beatrice. Yeah, I guess we have reached our time. So let me take this opportunity to say thank you, Richard, for organizing everything for us, and for all the participants for taking the time to spend with us, and to Eleanor, Stuart, and Catherine for their sharing their time. I look forward to following them in the future. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Any